Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
I still remember that dinner like it was yesterday, not because it was a family meal, but because of the weight of every word my mother threw at me across the table. The way her eyes flicked between my brother and me as if she were measuring my worth with some invisible ruler that I never asked to be measured by. And when she said, "Your brother's house is so impressive. When will you finally step up?" I felt something inside me that wasn't anger, not exactly, but a sharp, focused clarity. Like I could see everything she had been saying for years, all the little dismissals, all the side comments, all the comparisons disguised as casual conversation. And I calmly replied, "Funny, you missed the housewarming. I didn't invite anyone who doubts me." The fork she had been holding clattered against her plate, and, for a moment, the entire room felt frozen in a way I could not have orchestrated even if I had tried, because for the first time, I had taken control of the narrative instead of letting her set it for me. I had always been the quiet one, the one who watched everyone else move forward while I kept myself in the background, the one who smiled politely while she praised my brother for everything from his promotions to the tiniest improvement he made in his house. And I realized then that this was not about proving her wrong to make her feel bad, it was about proving to myself that I was capable of being the person I wanted to be without asking for her approval, and that the satisfaction I had been quietly building for years could finally be shown in a way that no one could ignore or twist into something negative. I had spent years watching, calculating, and planning without anyone noticing, making moves that seemed small or invisible at first, like staying late at work to build networks, investing time in projects that people considered unimportant, learning skills that no one asked me to learn, all while she and everyone else assumed I was drifting aimlessly or that I would eventually come crawling to her for guidance or judgment. And that night, as she sat there with her fork still clattering on the plate and my brother raising an eyebrow at the unusual tension, I realized that the calm tone in my voice carried more weight than any loud argument ever could, because it was backed by years of quiet strategy and preparation. I did not have to shout, I did not have to justify myself, I simply had to remind her in a single sentence that she had never truly seen what I was capable of, and that she had no standing to question my choices, and for the first time, I felt an odd mixture of liberation and anticipation, because I knew that her disbelief was the beginning of a chain reaction I had been preparing for without her realizing it, and as I looked at my brother, who smirked as if he thought he was untouchable because of his new house and the way she always praised him, I quietly calculated that his sense of security, built on her approval and his own assumptions about my failures, was about to become the very thing that would allow me to demonstrate my power and independence in ways neither of them could foresee or prevent. I left the table that night with no need to raise my voice, with no need to defend myself, and while she fumed silently across from me, I allowed myself the rare pleasure of imagining the subtle, but unmistakable shifts that were going to happen in the coming weeks, months, and perhaps even years, because I had built foundations that were invisible to them, but solid enough to support a life of autonomy and achievement that she had never imagined I could construct on my own. That fork clattering on the plate echoed in my mind not as a symbol of conflict, but as a signal that the first step had been taken, the first assertion of control over a story that she had always tried to write for me, and it felt exhilarating, terrifying, and entirely deserved, and I knew that from that moment on, every conversation, every gathering, every look of judgment or condescension would be measured against the quiet, but undeniable truth of the life I was building, a life that would not be dependent on her approval, a life that would not be diminished by her favoritism. And as I left the room, I could feel her words lingering, heavy in the air, but powerless to stop what I had already set into motion, and the calm in my voice was the beginning of a series of revelations that she would come to understand only when it was far too late to interfere. I spent the next days observing how she treated me in ways that were familiar, but now tinged with uncertainty, noticing the subtle adjustments she made in her tone, the slight hesitation in her questions, and the guarded way she brought up my brother's accomplishments, as if she suddenly realized that her standard tools of comparison no longer worked the way they used to, and while she assumed I was unaware of her internal recalibrations, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction knowing that I had shifted the dynamics at that table, and that the coming weeks would reveal even more of the consequences of that one calm sentence. I did not have to confront anyone further in that moment. My presence, my composure, and the silent proof of my independence were enough to plant seeds of doubt in their minds. Seeds that would grow as they watched me quietly continue on my path while they remained certain of their judgment and superiority, and I smiled inwardly at the knowledge that their assumptions were about to become the very tools I would use to assert my place in ways they could not anticipate, because I had already prepared for this moment in ways they could not see, relying on careful planning, patience, and the confidence that comes from years of underappreciated work. And as I thought about the future, I realized that this was only the first of many moments where control would shift, subtly but undeniably. And the satisfaction I derived from knowing I had chosen the right time and the right words was a pleasure they could neither diminish nor dispute. Even as I walked away from the table that evening, I knew that the real story was not the dinner itself, but the countless hours, decisions, and quiet achievements that had led me to that point. The ones that had allowed me to respond with precision rather than emotion, with strategy rather than frustration, and with the satisfaction of someone who had long understood that the real power comes from preparation, focus, and timing rather than loud proclamations or dramatic gestures. And I felt an unfamiliar but exhilarating sense of freedom, because for the first time, I had not just reacted to their judgments, but I had established the terms of my own narrative, and the reverberations of that single exchange were only just beginning to unfold. And they would unfold in ways that no one at that table, least of all my mother or my brother, could have predicted. The weeks that followed were full of subtle, almost invisible shifts. Conversations were quieter when I was around. My mother's compliments to my brother seemed more measured, and I noticed the way she lingered on certain phrases, as if trying to test me, to find a crack in my composure. And every time she failed, every time my calm and collected demeanor held strong, I felt a quiet thrill that was almost indescribable, because the power dynamics had shifted in ways she could not articulate, and the best part was that she would never see the full scope of the plan I had set in motion, the plan that would eventually make her realize that the measure of a person is not the house they own, the praise they receive, or the comparisons made by others, but the life they quietly build while everyone else is busy looking for flaws. After that dinner, the atmosphere in the house shifted in ways that were almost imperceptible at first, but I noticed everything. The slight hesitation in my mother's voice when she spoke to me about everyday matters, the way my brother's smiles occasionally faltered when he thought I wasn't looking, and the subtle way my presence seemed to alter the rhythm of conversations, because they had both been accustomed for so long to the idea that I would accept their judgment quietly, that I would nod along to their assumptions about my life and my choices without protest. And now, even in the most ordinary moments, I could see the uncertainty they had never before allowed themselves to feel. I spent the next few days observing them carefully, not because I wanted to watch them falter for the sake of cruelty, but because I had learned long ago that understanding how people perceive you is often the first step toward turning that perception into an advantage, and in doing so, I realized that the small moves I had been making quietly over the past few years, investing in my career, building networks, learning skills that seemed irrelevant to anyone else, but were critical to my future, managing my finances with careful precision, and taking control of opportunities that everyone assumed I would let pass, were now giving me leverage that neither my mother nor my brother could recognize or anticipate. The house, which had once felt like a prison of comparisons and silent judgment, became instead a testing ground where I could measure their reactions to small but calculated hints of my independence and capability. And I took care to maintain a calm and approachable demeanor so that they would continue to underestimate me, because I understood that their assumptions were a resource I could use, and that their overconfidence in my supposed shortcomings would make my eventual revelations all the more powerful and undeniable. Every time my mother mentioned my brother's house again, every time she asked questions laced with implication about my own progress or achievements, I responded with measured calm, sometimes with a touch of humor, sometimes with a pointed observation that revealed my awareness of her attitude without ever giving her the satisfaction of angering me, and I could see the internal calculations in her eyes. The way she adjusted her tone as if she were trying to regain control in a dynamic she no longer understood, and I realized with satisfaction that the first stage of my plan, establishing that I was no longer subject to her narrative, was working better than I had hoped, because their sense of certainty about who I was and what I was capable of had begun to crumble in ways I could manipulate subtly. Like a game of chess where each move is invisible to the opponent until it is too late to counter. During those days, I continued to make practical and strategic choices that would strengthen my position while maintaining the appearance of normalcy, because I had learned early in life that visible effort often invites scrutiny and criticism, while discreet action allows results to speak louder than explanations. And as I quietly advanced in my professional and personal life, I began to arrange circumstances that would allow me to demonstrate my progress without appearing boastful, which would both protect me from premature judgment and maximize the impact of the eventual revelations, and in doing so, I started to create situations where my mother and brother would encounter evidence of my independence in ways that they could not attribute to luck or coincidence. I accepted invitations selectively, cultivated relationships that enhanced my career, and quietly managed financial decisions that gave me control over my resources, all while maintaining the appearance of someone who was polite, cooperative, and entirely unremarkable, because I understood that the power of perception often outweighs the power of raw ability, and that by allowing them to underestimate me, I was creating the conditions for a revelation that would be undeniable, emotionally satisfying, and strategically brilliant. Every interaction with them became an opportunity to plant seeds of doubt, to challenge their assumptions without confrontation, and to position myself as someone whose independence, competence, and subtle influence could no longer be ignored. And I watched carefully as they stumbled over their own expectations, unaware that each hesitation, each cautious word, and each tentative observation was a direct response to the quiet but undeniable presence I had established. It was during one of these ordinary days, as my mother commented again on my brother's supposed accomplishments and implied that I was falling behind, that I decided it was time to execute the first tangible step of my plan. One that would be small enough to appear casual, but significant enough to leave a lingering impression, because I understood that the best strategies are those that create lasting psychological impact without drawing immediate attention to the maneuver itself. And I arranged a situation where my mother would witness, almost accidentally, evidence of a decision I had made that demonstrated both independence and success, something she could not interpret as mere luck or coincidence, and the effect was immediate. The brief, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, the slight pause in her voice, and the way my brother's confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second were all signs that the move had landed exactly as intended, and I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this was only the first of many carefully orchestrated moments that would cumulatively establish the reality she had never been willing to acknowledge, that I was capable of shaping my life, making decisions, and achieving results entirely on my own terms, and that her comparisons, judgments, and implied expectations no longer held power over me. By the time the week ended, I had positioned myself in a way that created a growing, almost imperceptible tension within the family. A tension that was not born of conflict or argument, but of the realization that their assumptions about me were increasingly unreliable, and that each casual remark they made, each attempt to compare or belittle, now existed in a space where they had no control, because I had quietly claimed it, and the sense of anticipation and calculated patience I felt was exhilarating, because I knew that the next steps, the more visible and emotionally impactful stages of my plan, would be even more satisfying and powerful, and that each subtle victory I had achieved so far was only a precursor to the eventual moment when the full extent of my strategy, preparation, and independence would be revealed in a way that left them stunned, speechless, and entirely aware of the reality they had ignored for so long. And as I reflected on the week, I realized with quiet pride That the calm confidence I had displayed at the dinner table had not been a single moment of courage, but the beginning of a meticulously executed series of actions designed to establish my control, demonstrate my independence, and deliver a level of emotional and strategic satisfaction that would be impossible to ignore, and that the best revenge, the most satisfying assertion of self, is not in loud confrontation but in quietly, deliberately proving the truth of your capabilities while those around you continue to underestimate and misjudge, unaware that the stage has already been set for the eventual revelation that would leave them speechless, scrambling to understand how they had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered. The following week, I found myself walking a delicate line between patience and action, fully aware that every conversation, every interaction with my mother and brother could either strengthen the perception I had carefully cultivated or unravel it if I allowed impatience or emotion to betray me, and I spent hours thinking through possible scenarios, imagining how each comment or glance might be interpreted, and mapping out a strategy that would allow me to reveal progress, independence, and accomplishment in a way that could not be dismissed, because I had learned early on that subtlety and timing are more powerful than confrontation, and that people rarely appreciate proof until it is undeniable, strategically positioned, and emotionally undeniable, which is exactly what I intended to achieve. I began by quietly managing my own finances in ways that gave me complete control over my resources, redirecting investments and savings into ventures that were calculated, low risk, but with significant potential for growth, and I did this without announcing any of it to my family, knowing that the true impact of financial independence lies not in boasting, but in demonstrating results when the moment is right. And this approach allowed me to make tangible progress, while keeping them convinced that I remained on the path they had always assumed I would struggle to follow. Each time my mother casually mentioned my brother's achievements or house, I allowed myself to listen without reaction, absorbing her tone, her word choice, and the way she framed my brother as the benchmark for success, and then, with careful deliberation, I allowed hints of my own accomplishments to surface in conversation, not directly, but subtly, like mentioning a meeting that had gone exceptionally well, or casually referencing a project I had completed ahead of schedule, or noting that I had successfully handled a situation that required skill, discretion, and initiative, and I watched their reactions closely, because the shift in their expressions, the micro-reactions that betrayed both surprise and discomfort, told me that my plan was beginning to take hold. I began inviting colleagues and mentors to informal gatherings, not at my home, but at locations they would hear about, casually, in conversation, and made sure that my mother, in particular, was aware that my life had depth, relationships, and professional connections that she could not dismiss, and each time she tried to redirect the conversation back to my brother, I gently steered it elsewhere with observations or questions that implied competence, resourcefulness, and independence, and I could see the frustration building in her eyes, because she had grown so accustomed to measuring me by my brother's achievements that the realization that I could quietly match or surpass them without confrontation was destabilizing. My brother, who had always been confident in his position as the golden child, began to exhibit subtle signs of unease, a slightly tighter posture when speaking, a less certain tone when responding to casual questions about his work or home. And I recognized these as early indicators that the dynamic had shifted, that he was no longer the unquestioned center of comparison in our family, and that the groundwork for a more visible assertion of my independence had been laid, which gave me a sense of control and anticipation that was deeply satisfying. As the days unfolded, I took care to create opportunities where my accomplishments would intersect with their awareness in ways that were natural but impossible to ignore. For example, arranging meetings where mutual acquaintances would comment on my projects, or where subtle achievements, such as successful negotiations or recognition from professional organizations, would be referenced in casual conversation, always ensuring that my family would overhear or learn about them, but in a context That made direct denial or dismissal impossible, and each small revelation worked like a thread in a larger tapestry I was weaving, a tapestry designed to culminate in a moment where the totality of my independence and skill could no longer be questioned, leaving them with only the recognition of the reality they had long assumed would never exist. At the same time, I began to think about my living situation, planning ways to create tangible evidence of my autonomy that extended beyond finances and career into daily life, because I knew that independence is most powerful when it is visible in practical terms, and I started taking steps to secure personal arrangements, plan travel, and manage responsibilities in ways that demonstrated my capacity to operate without oversight, support, or approval. And as I quietly executed these plans, I observed the subtle but growing tension. The way my mother's casual comparisons and dismissive remarks became less frequent and more hesitant, and how my brother's confident assertions occasionally faltered when he realized that the life I was building was neither accidental nor reliant on anyone else's support. It was during one particular conversation, over coffee with a neighbor who had known me since childhood, that the first truly satisfying moment of visible reversal occurred. When my mother made a passing comment about my brother's recent success, and I responded calmly with a reference to a professional achievement of my own, carefully worded so that it could not be interpreted as boastful but was undeniably significant. And I watched as the moment registered in my mother's eyes, the micro-expression of surprise followed by a rapid effort to re-establish control, and my brother, sitting quietly at the edge of the conversation, visibly processed the fact that I had achieved this milestone independently, without intervention, approval, or assistance from anyone else, and I realized in that instant that the first stage of real, undeniable recognition had arrived, that the subtle groundwork I had laid over weeks of careful observation, planning, and action had produced a tangible psychological shift, and that I could now begin moving toward the next phase, where my independence, judgment, and success would not only be observed, but directly felt by them in ways that could not be ignored, challenged, or diminished. By the end of the week, I had orchestrated small but cumulative victories that made their assumptions about me increasingly unreliable, that created a sense of tension and anticipation, and that positioned me perfectly for the next, more impactful stages of my plan. And while neither of them could yet articulate the change they were experiencing, the subtle unease, hesitation, and cautious observation in their words and expressions confirmed that the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. And I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the next moves would not only be strategically brilliant, but emotionally undeniable, because the foundation for a truly satisfying reversal had been established. And they had no idea how carefully I had engineered every step to reach this point. By the time the next family gathering arrived, I had carefully positioned myself in ways that allowed me to exercise subtle control over the conversation and the flow of information, ensuring that each statement I made, each casual remark, carried weight without appearing deliberate, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as my mother's habitual comments about my brother's accomplishments, the size of his house, and the implication that I was somehow failing in comparison began to falter under the weight of evidence she could no longer ignore. Because over the past several weeks I had cultivated not only professional and financial milestones, but also a network of relationships and small victories that were visible enough to be undeniable, yet subtle enough to feel natural. And I knew that the moment had arrived to execute the next, more dramatic stage of my plan, where the culmination of my quiet work would intersect with their awareness in a way that forced recognition, challenged their assumptions, and delivered the emotional satisfaction I had been building toward, and I was prepared to handle the reactions with the same calm and measured demeanor that had allowed me to reach this point. The gathering began as expected, with casual conversation about work, recent events, and family matters, and as my mother once again mentioned my brother's house, framing it as evidence of his ambition and my supposed shortcomings, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, signaling neither anger nor confrontation, and I casually remarked on a project I had recently completed that involved managing multiple contracts, negotiating terms, and delivering results ahead of schedule, and I observed closely as her fork, which she had been idly tapping on the edge of her plate, paused mid-motion, and the brief hesitation in my brother's posture revealed the subtle recognition that I was no longer the person they had assumed. That I was operating on a level of confidence, independence, and accomplishment they had neither anticipated nor respected, and the realization was thrilling because it confirmed that the foundation I had spent weeks establishing had now taken root, creating a shift in perception that would allow me to escalate further. As the evening continued, I allowed myself to guide conversations toward areas where my progress, financial stability, and professional achievements could be acknowledged indirectly, ensuring that my mother and brother could not dismiss the significance of what they were hearing, and I noticed that my mother's tone began to shift from casual superiority to careful measurement, as if she were recalibrating her expectations in real time, trying to reconcile the daughter she had long underestimated with the reality she was now observing, and I recognized the subtle psychological tension this produced, because it forced her to confront the discrepancy between her assumptions and the undeniable evidence of my independence. And I allowed that tension to grow incrementally, knowing that the emotional impact would be far more effective than direct confrontation, and that each carefully positioned statement, each strategic revelation, would compound until the cumulative effect created an undeniable moment of recognition that could not be ignored. At one point, my mother, perhaps attempting to regain control, made a pointed remark about my brother's latest home improvement and the ease with which he seemed to manage everything in his life, and I responded with a measured, calm observation about a recent investment I had successfully managed, framing it as a routine part of my life rather than an announcement of superiority, and I watched as her expression faltered, her words caught in her throat, and my brother, who had been listening with confidence, subtly shifted in his seat, his usual composure interrupted by the implicit acknowledgement that I was operating independently, effectively, and with results that matched or exceeded his own. And the satisfaction of seeing the long-term plan unfold with precise timing, without a single misstep, was deeply gratifying, because it validated every careful choice, every quiet effort, and every strategic action I had taken in preparation for this moment, and it confirmed that my methodical, patient approach to demonstrating competence and independence was yielding exactly the psychological and emotional effect I had intended. As the evening drew on, I made deliberate choices about when to speak and when to remain silent, allowing moments of pause and reflection to amplify the impact of each statement, and I carefully inserted references to professional connections, opportunities one had pursued, and milestones I had achieved without fanfare, ensuring that these details were heard, considered, and internalized by my mother and brother, and I observed with satisfaction as subtle signs of unease, hesitation, and recalibration appeared in their expressions and posture, indicating that they were beginning to understand, in real time, that the daughter they had underestimated was not only capable, but had quietly achieved a level of autonomy, accomplishment, and strategic insight that they had failed to anticipate, and I allowed that realization to settle in, knowing that the next phase, which would involve more visible and emotionally resonant moves, would carry the full weight of this groundwork and produce a reaction that was both undeniable and profoundly satisfying. By the end of the evening, the culmination of careful observation, strategic planning, and subtle revelation had produced the exact tension and recognition I had been working toward, leaving my mother and brother in a state of unsettled acknowledgement, where they could no longer comfortably dismiss my independence or achievements, and while they had yet to fully articulate or understand the extent of my autonomy and control, the emotional shift was palpable, the psychological terrain had changed irrevocably, and I felt a quiet, triumphant anticipation for the final stages of the plan, knowing that the most powerful, emotionally satisfying, and strategically brilliant moments were still to come, and that when they arrived, the full impact of patience, planning, and execution would leave no room for denial, argument, or misinterpretation, and the ultimate reversal of assumptions, the final assertion of independence and control, would be both undeniable and unforgettable. The final stage arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, as I had planned, because over the weeks and months leading up to this moment, I had carefully engineered every conversation, every casual remark, every subtle revelation to accumulate into a point where the culmination would be not just noticeable, but impossible to ignore. And as my family gathered once more for another routine dinner, I recognized in their expressions the residual tension and unease I had been nurturing, the slight hesitation in my mother's tone when she spoke of my brother's accomplishments, the way he now measured his words before asserting himself, and the almost imperceptible pause when they expected me to conform to the familiar pattern of self-effacement and doubt. And I knew that the stage was set for the decisive moves that would deliver the emotional, psychological, and practical reversal I had been orchestrating from the beginning. I began by speaking of recent developments in my professional life, framing them in the context of routine updates rather than achievements, but carefully choosing details that could not be dismissed, highlighting projects I had independently managed, opportunities one had pursued without assistance, and strategic decisions I had executed that required both foresight and initiative. And as I spoke, I observed the subtle reactions in their faces, the micro-expressions that betrayed both surprise and discomfort, knowing that this slow and deliberate buildup had primed them to feel the full weight of my autonomy and confidence, and that the combination of patience, strategy, and timing would make the eventual revelation not just impactful but emotionally undeniable, because they could no longer rationalize my success as luck, interference, or circumstance. And the acknowledgement of my achievements was beginning to register with an intensity that made their usual dominance and judgment ineffective and impotent. As the conversation continued, I introduced more tangible evidence of my independence, mentioning arrangements I had made for housing, financial stability, and personal projects, all framed casually as part of my day-to-day responsibilities. And I watched as my mother's confident tone faltered, her habitual comparisons to my brother giving way to a subtle recalibration, because she was beginning to realize that the daughter she had long underestimated had quietly established a life that required no approval, no guidance, and no validation from her. And my brother, who had always thrived on the unquestioned assumption of superiority, was forced to consider, perhaps for the first time, that the balance of influence and perception had shifted, and that I was no longer operating under the assumptions or limitations they had assigned to me. I had prepared for this moment carefully, knowing that subtlety alone would not be enough, so I allowed the conversation to flow toward topics where I could demonstrate both emotional and strategic control. And I deliberately referenced occasions where my decisions had produced measurable, undeniable results, ensuring that my mother and brother were both aware of my capability, foresight, and independence, and I could see the micro-shifts in their posture, the tightening of expressions, the almost imperceptible hesitation before responding, as the realization settled in that I had not only matched, but in many ways surpassed their expectations of competence and initiative, all achieved quietly, deliberately, and without reliance on their support, approval, or recognition, which made the revelation all the more powerful and satisfying because it could not be diminished or discredited. The climax of this stage came when I calmly referenced a significant recent milestone that I had deliberately chosen for maximum impact, a personal achievement that combined financial independence, strategic decision-making, and a measure of social and professional influence, framed in a way that presented it as a natural progression of my life rather than an assertion or boast. And I watched as my mother's fork clattered onto her plate, her eyes widening slightly as the weight of my autonomy and accomplishment registered fully, and my brother, who had been listening with measured detachment, subtly froze mid-motion, his previous confidence momentarily displaced by the sudden recognition that the assumptions upon which he had built his self-assurance no longer applied, and I could feel, with complete clarity, the psychological shift taking place. The unspoken acknowledgement that I had achieved what they had assumed was impossible, all without confrontation, anger, or overt challenge. And that the balance of power, perception, and emotional validation had irrevocably shifted in my favor. In the aftermath, the room was filled with a quiet tension, the kind that comes when the reality of someone's independence, confidence, and capability settles into the consciousness of those who had underestimated them for years. And I allowed myself to observe without commentary, letting the weight of the accumulated evidence, the carefully orchestrated revelations, and the undeniable proof of autonomy and success sink in. Because true emotional victory lies not in words or confrontation but in the inescapable acknowledgement of reality, and by the end of the evening, it was clear that my plan had reached its apex, leaving my mother and brother to confront the undeniable fact that the daughter and sister they had long assumed to be dependent, struggling or inferior had quietly, deliberately, and brilliantly established a life that demanded recognition, respect, and recalibration, and while some questions and tensions remained, the ultimate emotional, psychological, and strategic triumph was complete, and I left the gathering with the profound satisfaction that comes from seeing patience, strategy, and carefully executed action result in a moment of undeniable, breathtaking victory that had been years in the making, leaving no room for denial and no question about who had truly won. This was the moment where everything shifted, where the cumulative effect of careful planning, strategic action, and unwavering self-belief transformed years of underestimation into a clear, decisive reversal. And the satisfaction of watching my family recognize, finally and fully, the reality they had refused to see for so long, provided a validation that was not only emotionally powerful but strategically impeccable, and I knew, as I quietly collected my things and left the room, that the long game I had played had reached its perfect conclusion, leaving them stunned, recalibrated, and, ultimately, in full acknowledgement of the brilliance, independence, and unassailable competence I had built without their permission, guidance, or interference. And in that moment, the full weight of the plan, executed with patience, precision, and emotional intelligence, revealed itself as not only satisfying, but undeniably victorious.